Well, we're going to be today continuing our series on unlikely heroes, and this week we're going to be talking about Esther. And the title for our message this week is The Story of Esther and How God Works Behind the Scenes. Now, how many of you have ever been in a play? How many of you have at least gone to a play? Well, if you've gone to a play, you might see it and you think, oh, that was nice. But if you've been in a play, you know how much goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. The university I went to, they were really into doing plays there, because here's one of the plays I was in. That's me. Can't you tell? It's hard to see that. That's me, and that's me. And what was fun about this play was that I had to wear tons of different costumes. They all had capes. And it was kind of like a guy's dream, because there was like 28 guys and like one girl. We're all carrying around swords and like fighting each other. It was super fun. But if you were to go to that play, you would see like, oh, that's a nice play. You might see that and be like, oh, that looks pretty cool. But there are so many people working behind the scenes to pull off a play like that. Because first of all, the university I went to, they had 6 people who worked full-time just doing costumes. That was their job. 40 hours a week was doing costumes for plays. And they would go to New York and get the best kind of fabric and make custom-made outfits for everyone. And then you had makeup team. There was like probably 12 different people on that. And one of the plays I was in, they took some of my hair, went and got human hair that was the same color, and made a beard for me for that. Then they have about 12 people backstage doing, helping build the stage, but then also making all the sound and lights work. And actually my now brother-in-law, before we knew each other, he was on stage crew, and his job was to follow me with the light. So we had a connection before we even knew anybody, or knew each other. But the point is, there's so much going on behind the scenes that you have no idea about. Today we're going to talk about how God is doing so much behind the scenes that we don't know about. So turn with me to Esther chapter 2. Esther is not a book that a lot of people go to very often, so if you don't know where that is, at the front of your Bible, it'll tell you what page that's on. It's in the Old Testament. So Esther chapter 2. And before we move on, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time that we can know more about you and see you use people for your glory. And I just pray that we would be even more grateful for who you are and what you've done. And I just pray that your power would be on this, your message, and that we'd be attentive to see what you have for us. In your name, amen. Well, before we jump into this passage, let me give you some context of what's going on. So the last figure we talked about 2 weeks ago was Jonah, and Esther is 300 years after Jonah, and a lot has happened since then. Israel has become very disobedient to God and started serving idols. So what God allows to happen is for Israel to be conquered, taken away from Israel, and taken to another nation, which is not ideal. And the reason God is doing this, he's trying to bring the Jewish people back to himself. So at this point, the Jews are in Persia, and Xerxes, or another name for him is Ahasuerus, which we'll see in this passage, is the guy who's king. Now, you notice I said Esther 2. I'm going to summarize some of Esther just because there's a ton of verses there. So what happens in Esther 1, before we get to this in Esther 2, King Xerxes has a banquet, and his queen comes in unannounced. And you might think, okay, what's the big deal? Well, in that culture, that was a really big deal, and the king is furious that his queen came in unannounced, and he says, you know what, that's it, you're no longer my queen. So he tells everyone, I want you to go throughout all the land, get all the most beautiful and charming women, bring them to me, and I'm going to choose who the next queen's going to be. And then at the beginning of chapter 2 of Esther, we're introduced to a man named Mordecai. Now, Now, Mordecai is a Jew, and we're also introduced to Esther, who is his niece, and he is taking care of her like it's his child because her parents have died. So, knowing that, well, and one more thing before we jump into where we're going to jump into. So what ends up happening is the king finds out that Esther is very pretty and charming. She's grown at this point. So he has her come to the palace, and out of all these women, we don't know how many, but probably a lot of women, he chooses Esther to be his next queen. Now, the king does not know that Esther is a Jew. That's important to note later. And then also, so now that Esther is promoted to queen, Mordecai also gets promoted to the king's gate, is what it's called. He sits there and makes sure everything goes well. Knowing that, let's get into the passage. Look at verse 19 of chapter 2. It says, and when the virgins or women were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Esther had not yet shown her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, at this point in the story, this is not super important, but it's important to remember what's going on here. What happened is Mordecai, while sitting in the gate, finds out that these people are trying to kill the king, and he stops them. So you can say at this point the king owes him something. So that's important to remember for later. All right, now we're introduced to a new person in the story. Look at verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him above all the princes that were with him. So we're introduced to a new person here named Haman, and Haman is from a royal line. So Haman gets placed as one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. So because of that, people had to do something now to Haman. Look at verse 2. So then all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai bowed not, nor did reverence. The king's servant, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, why transgresseth thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them. And they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. So because Haman is in this high position, everybody is supposed to bow to him. That's just what you're supposed to do. Well, Mordecai, as a Jew, knows that the only person he's supposed to bow to is God. So he's definitely not going to bow to this man named Haman. So every time Haman comes by, Mordecai does not bow. And because of that, look what Haman responds to this. Look at verse 6. And he says, and he scorned to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for he has showed him in the people of Mordecai, wherein Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pure, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And Haman said unto the king Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispensing among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. And their laws are diverse from all the people. Neither keep they the king's law, therefore it is not the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to hands of those who have charged of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, and people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then with the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were of every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to the people and their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts unto the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. And upon every 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for prey. The copy of the writing for the commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan, the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. So what's happening here is Haman gets so angry that Mordecai is not bowing down to him that he thinks, you know what, I want to kill Mordecai. And, you might hear someone being so angry at another person they want to kill that person. Well, Haman goes a step further. He says, not only do I want to kill Mordecai, I want to kill all the Jews because Mordecai's a Jew. It's kind of like if a person's like, I hate you so much, I just don't want to kill you. I want to kill every single person that's related to you. That's a whole new level of angry, right? That's where Haman is at right now. So in order to accomplish that, he goes to the king and he says, "Oh, king, I have to tell you something. There are the Jews in this land, and they are not obeying your laws, and they're obeying their own laws. And because of that, they need to be punished. So we should wipe them out, and in fact, I will pay you, king, if you do this." So obviously these are lies that Haman is saying, but the king believes it. And so he's, okay, let's go wipe out the Jews. So now, knowing that's what's going to happen, we're going to see what Mordecai and Esther do for this. So the next thing that happens is chapter 4. I'm going to summarize this one as well, because it's kind of long. What happens is Esther finds out that the Jews are going to be wiped out, and she decides to help the Jews. You say, well, that makes sense. Well, think about this. This is actually a really big deal. Because remember at the beginning we said that the king doesn't know that Esther is a Jew? That means even if all the other Jews get wiped out, Esther is safe. So if she was just thinking about herself, she'd be like, I don't know these people. Why would I stick my neck out for them? And so it's kind of like, let's say you have the perfect hiding spot. You're playing hide and seek. If one of your friends is about to get caught, you don't get out and try to help them. You have the perfect hiding spot. Well, for Esther, she has the perfect hiding spot, so to speak, but she said, you know what, I'm going to step out in faith and I'm going to try to help these Jews. So how does Esther try to help these Jews? Look at chapter 5 and verse 1. Chapter 5 and verse 1. It says, Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in his royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, and she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Now this may seem like this is just a normal interaction, but let's remember, the queen before Esther, the reason she got kicked out was because she came before the king unannounced at a feast. And here Esther is going to have to do the same thing. But the thing is, Esther is new, so it's very possible he would just kill Esther for doing this. But she, in faith, stepped out, went before the king, knowing that it could be very well that she's going to be killed for this. And imagine you were there. Imagine you are in the king's court, and you see the new queen come out without being summoned by the king. I'm sure there was a hush over all the court. Thinking, oh man, what is going to happen? But thankfully, the king, I guess, was in a great mood, and he lowered the scepter to her, meaning that I accept her presence. And I'm sure Esther and the whole room, I'm glad no one's even killed today. So when that happens, now we're going to see what Esther asks for when she comes before the king. So look at verse 3. It says, Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given to thee unto half of the kingdom. So stop there. So it's interesting that the king is not upset that Esther has done this. He's in such a good mood that he says, you know what? Ask me whatever you want. I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. That's quite a thing to start off with. It's kind of like if your teenager came in and you're like, if you ask, I'll give you $1,000. That's probably very wise because what's your teenager going to do? I want $1,000. Well, the king is in this great mood and he says, all right, Esther, I'll give you anything up to half the kingdom. And so the first thing she asks for here is for a banquet. Because look what she says in verse 4. It says, and Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet, and I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, and come may as do Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. She asked that she had prepared. So stop there. So what she does is she says, King, I want to throw a banquet, and I want Haman to come to it. The king's like, okay, that's kind of a small request. But why does Esther want Haman to come? Well, look at the first thing that happens here. Look at verse 9. It says, Then went Haman forth that joyful day with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and he came home. He sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them all the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him. And now he advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh his wife and his friends said unto him, Let all the gallows be made 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou to the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon, and then go in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he sought his gallows to be made. So what happens is Mordecai, or Haman, is coming up. He sees Mordecai again, and he's reminded about how much he hates Mordecai and wants him to be dead. Kind of like maybe you struggle to be around someone, and if you're not around them for a while, it gets better, but as soon as you see him again, a lot of those emotions come back up. It's kind of like if you're picking a scab, right? It's just starting to heal, and you have to pick it off. Well, Haman sees Mordecai again and is reminded about how much he hates him. So he goes home, and he's telling his friends and his wife, he's bragging about how great he is. And while he's bragging, his friends bring up, and his wife, you know what? You have everything, but this Mordecai guy is bothering you. You should hang him. I mean, how often do you have a conversation with your friends and be like, hey, let's go build a guillotine in the backyard so we can kill who you're angry at? That's what they're doing. They're saying, let's just kill that guy you're getting angry at. So they're building the gallows, and so next we're going to see what happens to Haman with the king. So look at verse 1 of chapter 6. So speaking of Mordecai, verse 1 says, On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, that they were read before the king. And it was found that Mordecai had told Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done for Mordecai for this? Then the king's servants that ministered said unto him, There is nothing done for him. So stop there. So I don't know if you've ever been like this where you just can't sleep. And so what you have to do is you have to get out a really boring book, a really boring movie, and finally, it comes to this where you finally just fall asleep with something boring. So the king can't sleep, so he pulls out these old record books to try to fall asleep. And while he is reading these record books, he sees that Mordecai saved his life and nothing was done for him. Now, right when the king is thinking about that, Haman comes up. Look what happens in verse 4. It says, and the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom the king delighteth to honor more than myself. And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought from the king, useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And then let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, and that they may array the man withal the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fall all that thou hast spoken. Then took Haman the apparel of the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man who the king delighteth in honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. So stop there. So a crazy turn of events is happening here. So, like we said, the king just got done finishing reading about Mordecai, and he's thinking, you know what, he should be rewarded. And what happens? Haman walks in the door, and the king says, you know what, Haman, I'm going to ask you something. If there's someone that has done something great, how should I reward them? Well, Haman knows, well, you know what, Queen Esther has invited me to this banquet, so he must be talking about me. They must think I'm great. So he says, you know what, give him money, give him clothes, give him a horse. Let someone go before him and say how wonderful he is to everyone around. And Haman's thinking, yeah, this is for me. But then something happened that probably made Haman want to throw up. King's like, that's a good idea. Yeah, do that for Mordecai, which is Haman's sworn enemy. So Haman's thinking, oh, are you kidding me? So he has to go give Mordecai, his enemy, the clothes, the horse, and then Haman himself has to go before Mordecai singing his praises in the streets. So this is humiliating for Haman. Well, what happens at the banquet that Esther has planned? Look at verse 14. It says, and while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. And then verse 1 of chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And so it be granted it to thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, and my people, to be destroyed and to be slain and to perish. But if we have been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I held my tongue, although the enemy could have countervailed the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he? And thou dost presume in thy heart to do so. And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is the wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. So here we are at the banquet, and Esther is at the banquet. Haman comes to the banquet, and then as Esther comes before the king once again says to Esther, ask anything up to half the kingdom and I will give it to you. Esther then reveals that she is a Jew. and that her people are being wrongly accused, that the king has been lied to about what the Jews are doing. And so the king says, well, who's saying this? Who is saying these things? And then something happened that I'm sure Haman's stomach wanted to turn again. She turns to Haman and points to him and says, this is the man. So, I don't know about you, but if I were Haman, we'll have to come back to that. I guess you missed the slide. But if I were Haman, I'd be cowering in fear, right? I'd be so scared of what was happening. So Haman is terrified at this point, and then look what happens to him in verse 7. It says, and the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. And the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then the king said, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbardah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, and standeth in the house of Haman. And the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, that the king's wrath was pacified. So because of what Haman has done, the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, Haman gets hung on those. That's ironic. Now let me see. Can anybody think about what makes this statement ironic? I thought it was funny. Yeah, so that's an ironic saying. So this was very ironic for Haman to be hung on the gallows for Mordecai. Now, the last chapter of Esther is chapter 8, and I'm just going to summarize it. So what happens is Esther in here finalizes her petition with the king to not destroy the Jews. And the king says, okay, I'm not going to destroy them. And so instead of doing that, not only is he not destroying them, he gives all of Haman's wealth to Mordecai. And then on top of that, he says, if anybody tries to mess with the Jews, they can defend themselves, and by implication, I can stop them from doing this. So he's saying, no one can mess with the Jews in the future. Kind of like husbands, if you ever do something to your wife, what do? Give her flowers to make up for it, right? I messed up, I'm sorry, here's some flowers. So the king says, you know what, I realize I've messed up here, Jews, I'm going to make it better. So things get even better in the long run. So in conclusion, first of all, have you come to know this God that is working behind the scenes, that loves you, that wants to have a relationship with you? Have you accepted Jesus as your Savior? If you've not, come talk to me and we can discuss more about that. Now, like we said, our series is about unlikely heroes, and Esther is an orphan and is part of a conquered people as part of the Persian Empire, which means that the people in Persia think of Jews like leeches. They don't like them at all, and here's Esther, an orphan. So at the bottom of the totem pole, but yet she becomes the queen to the most powerful man in the world at that time, and then she helps save all of the Jews. So this unlikely hero did these great things, and this took a lot of courage from her, like we said, to come before the king and plead for other people, because she would have been safe, but she came, admitted she was a Jew, came for the king when she could have been killed, and then stuck up for them, and then also had to put her wits against one of the most powerful men in the kingdom of Haman. So this was very courageous of her. And so one of the points we're making with this series is that you don't have to be a super Christian to have God use you. You know, it could be to heal, you're having a hard time healing a broken relationship, or accomplishing something you don't think you can, or have peace in a time of storm. These things seem too great to do. Well, they're not too great for God. And if we are willing to step out in faith, like Esther, he can help us do those things. Now, the other thing we're doing with our series is we are saying a characteristic about God. And like we said at the beginning, we're talking about how God works behind the scenes. Because here's what's crazy. While we were reading through the book of Esther, did you ever see God named once? No. In all of the book of Esther, God is not named even once. And you say, okay, so there's a book in the Bible that doesn't even talk about God, doesn't even use his name? Yep. Why on earth would that be part of the Bible? It's showing that God is working behind the scenes. Because think about this. Here are the Jews on the edge of extinction. And in order for them to not be wiped out, so many things have to just happen by chance. Because think about this. So the queen, before Esther, knowing that she would probably be kicked out, just happens to come before the king, and he throws her out. And then Esther just happens to be the right age, and beautiful, and charming. And out of all the people, he chooses her. And then that when he finds out about finds out about Mordecai, that he saved the king, and then right when that happens, Haman comes in, and they get all confused. Or that when Esther comes before the king, and the king just happens to be in a good mood and not throw her out like the last queen, and then just happens to say whatever you want up to half the kingdom. There are so many things that had to happen perfectly for this to work. And you would say that just happened by chance? Well, God's not named. Well, that happening by chance, all those things, because you could maybe explain a couple of those things away as just chance, but all of those things, it's kind of like winning the lottery 5 times in a row. That's kind of like what's happening here. You can't explain that these things are just happening by chance. God is working behind the scenes for her and the Jews' good and for his glory. And that goes for us as well. God is working behind the scenes. So the wonderful thing is that if there's stuff going on in your life right now and you're thinking, why on earth is this all going on? And it just seems like craziness is happening. God right now is working behind the scenes of all this. Everything in your life, all around it, whether you realize it or not. Because what's so amazing about God is that he is infinite and not bound by time or space. Meaning that, so is God in control of a lot of things? Yes. But because he's infinite and outside of time and space, he can focus on every single detail in your life as if he had nothing else going on. So right now, whether you realize it or not, God is intricately involved in every single detail of your life. And the good news is, he loves you. He died on a cross for you. And so when he's that involved in every single detail in your life and is working all these things out, we can trust that this hard thing that I'm going through, there is a purpose. And that God can help me through this. And that in the future, if I'm afraid of the future, guess what? God is already there working out all of these details behind the scenes. I don't know if you've ever been a part of a large wedding or been to a large wedding, but oftentimes they have here, which is, this lady is a wedding planner, doing all of these things behind the scenes so that the wedding can be amazing. God is doing all these things behind the scenes for your good and for his glory. And so for that, let's praise him. Let's pray. Father, we are thankful that you are always at work in our lives for our good and for your glory. That you just care that much about us is just amazing, and how much peace that can bring. And we just thank you that we don't have to control life because you are doing all that in the best way possible, and that you can turn any circumstance, even a bad circumstance, into good, as you did here in the life of Esther. We thank you that you are that concerned and that involved in our life. God, I pray for all of us in here that are going through hardships and trials and struggles, that you would help us to trust you like Esther was doing, and to see you do amazing things. And God, we are just so thankful for that. I pray if there's anybody here that's not accepted you as their Savior, that you would convict them of that, show them that they need a Savior, and that they would take care of that today. We thank you in your name. Amen.